Book 5, Chapters 13 and 14 of On War by Karl von Clausewitz, translated by J. Graham. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Timothy Ferguson. Chapter 13. Cantonments. In the modern system of war, cantonments have become again indispensable, because neither tents nor a complete military train make an army independent of them. Huts and open-air camps, bivouacs as they are called, however far such arrangements may be carried, can still never become the usual way of locating troops without sickness gaining the upper hand and prematurely exhausting their strength, sooner or later, according to the state of the weather or climate. The campaign in Russia in 1812 is one of the few in which, in a very severe climate, the troops, during the 6 months that it lasted, hardly ever lay in cantonments. But what was the consequence of this extreme effort, which should be called an extravagance, if that term was not much more appropriate to the political conception of the enterprise? Two things interfere with the occupation of cantonments: the proximity of the enemy and the rapidity of movement. For these reasons they are quitted as soon as the decision approaches, and cannot again be taken up until the decision is over. In modern wars, that is, in all campaigns during the last 25 years which occur to us at this moment, the military element has acted with full energy. Nearly all that was possible has generally been done in them, as far as regards activity and the utmost effort of force. But all these campaigns have been of short duration. They have seldom exceeded half a year. In most of them, a few months suffice to bring matters to a crisis, that is, to a point where the vanquished enemy saw himself compelled to sue for an armistice, or at once for peace, or to a point where, on the conqueror's part, the impetus of victory had exhausted itself. During this period of extreme effort, there could have been little question of cantonments, for even in the victorious march of the pursuer, if there was no longer any danger, the rapidity of movement made that kind of relief impossible. But when, from any cause, the course of events is less impetuous, when a more even oscillation and balancing of forces takes place, then the housing of troops must again become a foremost subject for attention. This want has some influence even on the conduct of war itself, partly in this way, that we seek to gain more time and security by a stronger system of outposts, by a more considerable advanced guard thrown further forward, and partly in this way, that our measures are governed more by the richness and fertility of the country than by the tactical advantages which the ground affords. In the geometrical relations of lines and points, a commercial town of 20 or 30,000 inhabitants, a road thickly studded with large villages or flourishing towns, give such facilities for assembling in one position large bodies of troops, and this concentration gives such a freedom and such a latitude for movement as fully compensate for the advantages which the better situation of some point may otherwise present. On the form to be followed in arranging cantonments, we have only a few observations to make, as this subject belongs, for the most part, to tactics. The housing of troops comes under two heads, inasmuch as it can either be the main point or only a secondary consideration. If the disposition of the troops in the course of a campaign is regulated by grounds purely tactical and strategical, and if, as is done more especially with cavalry, they are directed for their comfort to occupy the quarters available in the vicinity of the point of concentration of the army, then the quarters are subordinate considerations and substitutes for camps. They must therefore be chosen within such a radius that the troops can reach the point of assembly in good time. But if an army takes up quarters to rest and refresh, then the housing of the troops is the main point, and the other measures, consequently also the selection of the particular point of assembly, will be influenced by that object. The first question for examination here is as to the general form of the cantonments as a whole. The usual form is that of a very long oval, a mere widening, as it were, of the tactical order of battle. The point of assembly for the army is in front, the headquarters in rear. Now, these arrangements are, in point of fact, adverse, even almost opposed to the safe assembly of the army on the approach of the enemy. The more the cantonments form a square, or rather a circle, the quicker the troops can concentrate at any one point, that is, the centre. The further the place of assembly is placed in rear, the longer the enemy will be in reaching it, and therefore the more time is left us to assemble. A point of assembly in rear of the cantonments can never be in danger, and on the other hand, the farther the headquarters are in advance, so much the sooner reports arrive, therefore so much the better is the commander informed of everything. At the same time, the first named arrangements are not devoid of points which deserve some attention. By the extension of cantonments in width, we have in view the protection of the country which would otherwise be laid under contributions by the enemy. But this motive is neither thoroughly sound, nor is it very important. It is only sound as far as regards the country on the extremity of the wings, but does not apply at all to the intermediate spaces existing between separate divisions of an army. If the quarters of those divisions are drawn close around their point of assembly, for no enemy will venture into those intervals of space. And it is not very important, because there are simpler means of shielding the districts in our vicinity from the enemy's requisitions than scattering the army itself. The placing of the point of assembly in front is with a view to covering the quarters, for the following reasons. In the first place, a body of troops suddenly called to arms always leaves behind it in cantonments a trail of stragglers, sick, baggage, provisions, etc., etc., which may easily fall into the enemy's hands if the point of assembly is placed in rear. In the second place, we have to apprehend that if the enemy with some bodies of cavalry passes by the advanced guard, or if it is defeated in any way, he may fall upon scattered regiments or battalions. If he encounters a force drawn up in good order, although it is weak, and in the end must be overpowered, still he is brought to a stop, and in that way time is gained. As respects the position of the headquarters, it is generally supposed that it cannot be made too secure. According to these different considerations, we may conclude that the best arrangement for districts of cantonments is where they take an oblong form, approaching the square or circle, have the point of assembly in the centre, and the headquarters placed on the front line, well protected by considerable masses of troops. What we have said as to covering of the wings in treating of the disposition of the army in general applies here also. Therefore, corps detached from the main body, right and left, although intended to fight in conjunction with the rest, will have particular points of assembly of their own in the same line with the main body. Now, if we reflect that the nature of a country on one hand by favourable features in the ground determines the most natural point of assembly, and on the other hand by the positions of towns and villages determines the most suitable situation for cantonments, then we must perceive how very rarely any geometrical form can be decisive in our present subject. But yet it was necessary to direct attention to it, because, like all general laws, it affects the generality of cases in a greater or less degree. What now remains to be said as to an advantageous position for cantonments is that they should be taken up behind some natural obstacle of ground affording cover, whilst the sides next the enemy can be watched by small but numerous detached parties. Or they may be taken up behind fortresses, which, when circumstances prevent any estimate being formed of the strength of their garrisons, impose upon the enemy a greater feeling of respect and of caution. We reserve the subject of winter quarters, covered by defensive works, for a separate article. The quarters taken up by troops on a march differ from those called standing cantonments in this way, that in order to save the troops from unnecessary marching, cantonments on a march are taken up as much as possible along the lines of march, and are not at any considerable distance on either side of these roads. If their extension in this sense does not exceed a short day's march, the arrangement is not one at all unfavourable to the quick concentration of the army. In all cases in presence of the enemy, according to the technical phrase in use, that is, in all cases where there is no considerable interval between the advanced guards of the two armies respectively, the extent of the cantonments and the time required to assemble the army determine the strength and position of the advanced guard and outposts. But when these must be suited to the enemy and circumstances, then, on the contrary, the extent of the cantonments must depend on the time which we can count upon by the resistance of the advanced guard. In the third chapter of this book, *8th chapter, we have stated how this resistance, in the case of an advanced corps, may be estimated. From the time of that resistance we must deduct the time required for transmission of reports and getting the men under arms, and the remainder only is the time available for assembling at the point of concentration. We shall conclude here also by establishing our ideas in the form of a result, such as is usual under ordinary circumstances. If the distance at which the advanced guard is detached is the same as the radius of the cantonments, and the point of assembly is fixed in the centre of the cantonments, then the time which is gained by checking the enemy's advance would be available for the transmission of intelligence and getting under arms, and would in most cases be sufficient, even though the communication is not made by means of signals, cannon shots, etc., but simply by relays of orderlies, the only really sure method. With an advanced guard pushed forward 3 miles in front, our cantonments might therefore cover a space of 30 square miles. In a moderately peopled country there would be 10,000 houses in this space, which for an army of 50,000, after deducting the advanced guard, would be 4 men to a billet, therefore very comfortable quarters, and for an army of twice the strength, 9 men to a billet, therefore still not very close quarters. On the other hand, if the advanced guard is only 1 mile in front, we could only occupy a space of 4 square miles, for although the time gained does not diminish exactly in proportion as distance of the advanced guard diminishes, and even with a distance of 1 mile we may still calculate on a gain of 6 hours, yet the necessity for caution increases when the enemy is so close. But in such a space an army of 50,000 men could only find partial accommodation even in a very thickly populated country. From all this we see what an important part is played here by great, or at least considerable towns, which can afford convenience for sheltering 10,000 or even 20,000 men almost at one point. From this result it follows that if we are not very close to the enemy and have a suitable advanced guard, we might remain in cantonments even if the enemy is concentrated, as Frederick the Great did at Breslau in the beginning of the year 1762, and Bonaparte at Witterbach in 1812. But although by preserving a right distance and by suitable arrangements we have no reason to fear not being able to assemble in time, even opposite an enemy who is concentrated, yet we must not forget that an army engaged in assembling itself in all haste can do nothing else in that time, that it is therefore, for a time at least, not in a condition to avail itself in an instant of fortuitous opportunities, which deprives it of the greater part of its really efficient power. The consequence of this is, that an army should only break itself up completely in cantonments under some one or other of the following 3 cases: 1, if the enemy does the same; 2, if the condition of the troops makes it unavoidable; 3, if the more immediate object with the army is completely limited to the maintenance of a strong position, and therefore the only point of importance is concentrating the troops at that point in good time. The campaign of 1815 gives a very remarkable example of the assembly of an army from cantonments. General Ziethen, with Blucher's advanced guard, 30,000 men, was posted at Charleroi, only 2 miles from Sombref, the place appointed for the assembly of the army. The farthest cantonments of the army were about 8 miles from Sombref, that is, on the side beyond Ciney, and on the other near Liège. Notwithstanding this, the troops cantoned about Ciney were assembled at Ligny several hours before the battle began, and those near Liège, Bulow's corps, would have been also had it not been for accident and faulty arrangements in the communication of orders and intelligence. Unquestionably, proper care for the security of the Prussian army was not taken, but in explanation we must say that the arrangements were made at a time when the French army was still dispersed over widely extended cantonments, and that the real fault consisted in not altering them the moment the first news was received that the enemy's troops were in movement, and that Bonaparte had joined the army. Still it remains noteworthy that the Prussian army was able in any way to concentrate at Sombref before the attack of the enemy. Certainly on the night of the 14th, that is 12 hours before Ziethen was actually attacked, Blucher received information of the advance of the enemy and began to assemble his army. But on the 15th, at 9 in the morning, Ziethen was already hotly engaged, and it was not until the same moment that General Thielmann at Ciney first received orders to march to Namur. He had therefore to assemble his divisions and to march 6.5 miles to Sombref, which he did in 24 hours. General Bulow would also have been able to arrive about the same time if the order had reached him, as it should have done. But Bonaparte did not resolve to make his attack on Ligny until 2 in the afternoon of the 16th. The apprehension of having Wellington on the one side of him and Blucher on the other, in other words, the disproportion in the relative forces, contributed to this slowness. Still, we see how the most resolute commanders may be detained by the cautious feeling of the way, which is always unavoidable in cases which are to a certain degree complicated. Some of the considerations here raised are plainly more tactical than strategic in their nature, but we have preferred rather to encroach a little than to run the risk of not being sufficiently explicit. End of chapter 13. Chapter 14. Subsistence. This subject has acquired much greater importance in modern warfare from 2 causes in particular. First, because the armies in general are now much greater than those of the Middle Ages, and even those of the Old World, for although formerly armies did appear here and there, which equalled or even surpassed modern ones in size, these were only rare and transient occurrences, whilst in modern military history, since the time of Louis XIV, Armies have always been very strong in number. But the second cause is still more important, and belongs entirely to modern times. It is the very much closer inner connection which our wars have in themselves, the constant state of readiness for battle of the belligerents engaged in carrying them on. Almost all old wars consisted of single unconnected enterprises, which are separated from each other by intervals, during which the war in reality either completely rested, and only still existed in a political sense, or when the armies at least had removed so far from each other that each, without any care about the army opposite, only occupied itself with its own wants. Modern wars, that is, wars that have taken place since the Peace of Westphalia, have, through the efforts of respective governments, taken a more systematic connected form. The military object in general predominates everywhere, and demands also that arrangements for subsistence shall be on an adequate scale. Certainly there were long periods of inaction in the wars of the 17th and 18th centuries, almost amounting to a cessation of war. These are the regular periods passed in cantonments. Still, even those periods were subordinate to the military object. They were caused by the inclemency of the season, not by any necessity arising out of the subsistence of the troops, and as they regularly terminated with the return of summer, therefore we may say, at all events, uninterrupted action was the rule of war during the fine season of the year. As the transition from one situation or method of action to another always takes place gradually, so it was in the case before us. In the wars against Louis XIV, the Allies used still to send their troops into winter cantonments in distant provinces in order to subsist them the more easily. In the Silesian War, that was no longer done. This systematic and connected form of carrying on war only became possible when states took regular troops into their service in place of the feudal armies. The obligation of the feudal law was then commuted into a fine or contribution. Personal service either came to an end, enlistment being substituted, or it was only continued amongst the lowest classes, as the nobility regarded the furnishing a quota of men, as is still done in Russia and Hungary, as a kind of tribute, a tax in men. In every case, as we have elsewhere observed, armies became henceforward an instrument of the cabinet, their principal basis being the treasury or revenue of the government. Just the same kind of thing, which took place in the mode of raising and keeping up an establishment of troops, could not but follow in the mode of subsisting them. The privileged classes having been released from the first of these services on payment of a contribution in money, the expense of the latter could not be again imposed on them quite so easily. The cabinet and the treasury had therefore to provide for the subsistence of the army, and could not allow it to be maintained in its own country at the expense of the people. Administrations were therefore obliged to look upon the subsistence of the army as an affair for which they were specifically responsible. The subsistence thus became more difficult in two ways. First, because it was an affair belonging to government, and next, because the forces required to be permanently embodied to confront those kept up in other states. Thus arose a separate military class in the population, with an independent organisation provided for its subsistence, and carried out to the utmost possible perfection. Not only were stores of provisions collected, either by purchase or by deliveries in kind from the landed estates (Dominialieferungen), consequently from distant points and lodged in magazines, but they were also forwarded from these by means of special waggons, baked near the quarters of the troops in ovens temporarily established, and from thence again carried away at last by the troops by means of another system of transport attached to the army itself. We take a glance at this system not merely from its being characteristic of the military arrangements of the period, but also because it is a system which can never be entirely done away. Some parts of it must continually reappear. Thus military organisation strove perpetually towards becoming more independent of people and country. The consequence was that in this manner war became certainly a more systematic and more regular affair, and more subordinated to the military, that is, the political object. But it was at the same time also much straitened and impeded in its movement, and infinitely weakened in its energy, for now an army was tied to its magazine, limited to the working powers of its transport service, and it naturally followed that the tendency of everything was to economise the subsistence of the troops. The soldier fed on a wretched pittance of bread, moved about like a shadow, and no prospect of a change for the better comforted him under his privations. Whoever treats this miserable way of feeding soldiers as a matter of no moment, and points to what Frederick the Great did with soldiers subsisted in this manner, only takes a partial view of the matter. The power of enduring privations is one of the finest virtues in a soldier, and without it no army is animated with the true military spirit. But Such privation must be of a temporary kind, commanded by the force of circumstances, and not the consequences of a wretchedly bad system, or of a parsimonious abstract calculation of the smallest ration that a man can exist upon. When such is the case, the powers of the men individually will always deteriorate physically and morally. What Frederick the Great managed to do with his soldiers cannot be taken as a standard for us, partly because he was opposed to those who pursued a similar system, partly because we do not know how much more he might have achieved if he had been able to let his troops live as Bonaparte allowed his whenever circumstances permitted. The feeding of horses by an artificial system of supply is, however, an experiment which has not been tried, because forage is much more difficult to provide on account of its bulk. A ration for a horse weighs about 10 times as much as one for a man, and the number of horses with an army is more than 1/10 the number of men. At present it is 1/4 or 1/3, and formerly it was 1/3 to 1/2. Therefore the weight of the forage required is 3, 4, or 5 times as much as that of the soldiers' rations required for the same period of time. On this account the shortest and most direct means were taken to meet the wants of an army in this respect, that is, by foraging expeditions. Now these expeditions occasioned great inconvenience in the conduct of the war in other ways, first by making it a principal object to keep the war in the enemy's country, and next because they made it impossible to remain very long in one part of the country. However, at the time of the Silesian War, foraging expeditions were much less frequent. They were found to occasion a much greater drain upon the country, and much greater waste than if the requirements were satisfied by means of requisitions and imposts. When the French Revolution suddenly brought again upon the war stage a national army, the means which governments could command were found insufficient, and the whole system of war, which had its origin in the limited extent of these means, and found again its security in this limitation, fell to pieces. And of course in the downfall of the whole was included that of the branch of which we are now speaking, the system of subsistence. Without troubling themselves about magazines, and still less about such an organisation as the artificial clockwork of which we have spoken, by which the different divisions of the transport service went round like a wheel, the leading spirits of the Revolution sent their soldiers into the field, forced their generals to fight, subsisted, reinforced their armies, and kept alive the war by a system of exaction, and of helping themselves to all they required by robbery and plunder. Between these two extremes, the war under Bonaparte and against him preserved a sort of medium, that is to say, it just made use of such means as suited it best amongst all that were available, and so it will be in the future. The modern method of subsisting troops, that is, seizing everything which is found in the country without regard to meum et tuum, may be carried out in 4 different ways, that is, subsisting on the inhabitant, contributions which the troops themselves look after, general contributions, and magazines. All 4 are generally applied together, one generally prevailing more than the others. Still it sometimes happens that only one is applied entirely by itself. 1. Living on the inhabitant or on the community, which is the same thing. If we bear in mind that in a community consisting even, as it does in great towns, of consumers only, there must always be provisions enough to last for several days, we may easily see that the most densely populated place can furnish food and quarters for a day for about as many troops as there are inhabitants, and for a less number of troops for several days without the necessity of any particular previous preparation. In towns of considerable size, this gives a very satisfactory result, because it enables us to subsist a large force at one point, but in smaller towns or even in villages, the supply would be far from sufficient, for a population of 3,000 or 4,000 in a square mile, which would be large in such a space, would only suffice to feed 3,000 or 4,000 soldiers, and if the whole mass of troops is great, they would have to be spread over such an extent of country at this rate as would hardly be consistent with other essential points. But in level countries, and even in small towns, the quantity of those kinds of provisions which are essential in war is generally much greater. The supply of bread which a peasant has is generally adequate to the consumption of his family for several, perhaps from 8 to 14 days. Meat can be obtained daily, vegetable productions are generally forthcoming in sufficient quantity to last until the following crop. Therefore, in quarters which have never been occupied, there is no difficulty in subsisting troops 3 or 4 times the number of the inhabitants for several days, which again is a very satisfactory result. According to this, where the population is about 2,000 or 3,000 per square mile, and if no large town is included, a column of 30,000 would require about 4 square miles, which would be a length of side of 2 miles. Therefore, for an army of 90,000, which we may reckon at about 75,000 combatants, if marching in 3 columns contiguous to each other, we should require to take up a front 6 miles in breadth, in case 3 roads could be found within that breadth. If several columns follow one another into 3 cantonments, then special measures must be adopted by the civil authorities, and in that way there can be no great difficulty in obtaining all that is required for a day or 2 more. Therefore, if the above 90,000 are followed the day after by a like number, even these last would suffer no want. This makes up the large number of 150,000 combatants. Forage for the horses occasions still less difficulty, as it requires neither grinding nor baking, and as there must be forage forthcoming in sufficient quantity to last the horses in the country until next harvest. Therefore, even when there is little stall feeding, still there should be no want, only the deliveries of forage should certainly be demanded from the community at large, not from the inhabitants individually. Besides, it's supposed that some attention is, of course, paid to the nature of the country in making arrangements for a march, so as not to send cavalry mostly into places of commerce and manufactures, and into districts where there is no forage. The conclusion to be drawn from this hasty glance is, therefore, that in a moderately populated country, that is, a country of from 2,000 to 3,000 souls per square mile, an army of 150,000 combatants may be subsisted by the inhabitants and community for 1 or 2 days within such a narrow space as will not interfere with its concentration for battle. That is, therefore, that such an army can be subsisted on a continuous march without magazines or other preparation. On this result were based the enterprises of the French army in the Revolutionary War and under Bonaparte. They marched from Adige to the lower Danube, and from the Rhine to the Vistula, with little means of subsistence except upon the inhabitants, and without ever suffering want. As their undertakings depended on moral and physical superiority, as they were attended with certain results, and were never delayed by indecision or caution, therefore their progress in the career of victory was generally that of an uninterrupted march. If circumstances are less favourable, if the population is not so great, or if it contains more of artisans than agriculturalists, if the soil is bad, the country already several times overrun, then of course the results will fall far short of what we have supposed. Still, we must remember that if the breadth of the front of the column is extended from 2 miles to 3, we get a superficial extent of country more than double in size, that is, instead of 4 we command 9 square miles, and that this is still an extent which in ordinary cases will always admit of concentration for action. We see, therefore, that even under unfavourable circumstances this method of subsistence will still be always compatible with a continuous march. But if a halt of several days takes place, then great distress must ensue if preparations have not been made beforehand for such an event in other ways. Now, these preparatory measures are of 2 kinds, and without them a considerable army even now cannot exist. The first is equipping the troops with a waggon train, by means of which bread or flour, as the most essential part of their subsistence, can be carried with them for a few, that is, for 3 or 4 days. If to this we add 3 or 4 days' rations which the soldier himself can carry, then we have provided what is most indispensable in the way of subsistence for 8 days. The second arrangement is that of a regular commissariat, which, whenever there is a moment's halt, gathers provisions from distant localities, so that at any moment we can pass over from the system of quartering on the inhabitants to a different system. Subsisting in cantonments has the immense advantage that hardly any transport is required, and that it is done in the shortest time, but certainly it supposes as a prior condition that cantonments can be provided for all the troops. 2. Subsistence through exactions enforced by the troops themselves. If a single battalion occupies a camp, this camp may be placed in the vicinity of some villages, and these may receive notice to furnish subsistence. Then the method of subsistence would not differ essentially from the preceding mode. But, as is most usual, if the mass of troops to be encamped at some point is much larger, there is no alternative than to make a collection in common within the circle of districts marked out for the purpose, collecting sufficient for the supply of one of the parts of the army, a brigade or division, and afterwards to make a distribution from the common stock thus collected. The first glance shows that by such a mode of proceeding the subsistence of a large army would be a matter of impossibility. The collection made from the stores in any given district in the country will be much less than if the troops had taken up their quarters in the same district. For when 30 or 40 men take possession of a farmer's house, they can, if necessary, collect the last mouthful, but one officer sent with a few men to collect provisions has neither time nor means to hunt out all the provisions that may be stored in a house. Often also he has not the means of transport. He will therefore only be able to collect a small portion of what is actually forthcoming. Besides, in camps the troops are crowded together in such a manner at one point that the range of country from which provisions can be collected in a hurry is not of sufficient extent to furnish the whole of what is required. What could be done in the way of supplying 30,000 men within a circle of a mile in diameter, or from an area of 3 or 4 square miles? Moreover, it would seldom be possible to collect even what there is, for the most of the nearest adjacent villages would be occupied by small bodies of troops, who would not allow anything to be removed. Lastly, by such a measure would be the greatest waste, because some men would get more than they required, while a great deal would be lost and of no benefit to anyone. The result is, therefore, that the subsistence of troops by forced contributions in this manner can only be adopted with success when the bodies of troops are not too large, not exceeding a division of 8 or 10,000 men, and even then it is only to be resorted to as an unavoidable evil. It cannot in general be avoided in the case of troops directly in front of the enemy, such as the advanced guards and outposts, when the army is advancing, because these bodies must arrive at points where no preparations could have been made, and they are usually too far from the stores collected for the rest of the army. Further, in the case of movable columns acting independently, and lastly, in cases where by chance there is neither time nor means to procure subsistence in any other way. The more troops are accustomed to live by regular requisitions, the more time and circumstances permit the adoption of that way of subsisting, then the more satisfactory will be the result. But time is generally wanting, for what the troops get for themselves directly is got much quicker. 3. By regular requisitions. This is unquestionably the simplest and most efficacious means of subsisting troops, and it has been the basis of all modern warfare. It differs from the preceding way chiefly by having the co-operation of the local authorities. The supply in this case must not be carried off forcibly just from the spot where it is found, but be regularly delivered according to an equitable division of the burden. Thus, division can only be made by the recognised official authorities of the country. In this all depends on time. The more time there is, the more general can the division be made, and less will it press on individuals, and the more regular will be the result. Even purchases may be made with ready money to assist, in which way it will approach the mode which follows next in order (magazines). In all assemblages of troops in their own country there is no difficulty in subsisting by regular requisitions, neither as a rule is there any in retrograde movements. On the other hand, in all movements into a country of which we are not in possession, there is very little time for such arrangements, seldom more than the one day which the advanced guard is in the habit of preceding the army. With the advanced guard, the requisitions are sent to the local officials, specifying how many rations they are to have ready at such and such places. As these can only be furnished from the immediate neighbourhood, that is, within a circuit of a couple of miles round each point, the collections so made in haste will never be nearly sufficient for an army of considerable strength, and consequently, if the troops do not carry with them enough for several days, they will run short. It is therefore the duty of the commissariat to economise what is received, and only to issue to those troops who have nothing. With each succeeding day, however, the embarrassment diminishes. That is to say, if the distances from which provisions can be procured increase in proportion to the number of days, then the superficial area over which the contribution can be levied increases as the squares of the distance gained. If on the first day only 4 square miles have been drawn upon, the next day we shall have 16, on the third 36, therefore on the second day 12 more than the first, and on the third day 20 more than the second. Of course, this is a mere rough estimate of what may take place, subject to many modifying circumstances which may intervene, of which the principal is that one district may not be capable of contributing like another. But on the other hand, we must also remember that the radius within which we can levy may increase more than 2 miles a day in width, perhaps 3 or 4, or in many places still more. The due execution of these requisitions is enforced by detachments placed under the orders of the official functionaries, but still more by fear of responsibility, punishment, and ill treatment, which in such cases, like a general weight, presses on the whole population. However, it's not our intention to enter into details into the whole machinery of commissariat and army subsistence. We have only results in view. The result to be derived by a common sense view of all the circumstances in general, and the view which the experience of the wars since the French Revolution tends to confirm is, that even the largest army, if it carries with it provisions for a few days, may undoubtedly be subsisted by contributions which, commencing at the moment of entering a country, affect at first only the districts in the immediate vicinity of the army, but afterwards, in the course of time, are levied on a greater scale, over a range of country always increasing, and with an ever increasing weight of authority. This resource has no limits except those of exhaustion, impoverishment, and devastation of the country. When the stay of an invading army is of some duration, the administration of this system at last is handed over to those in the highest official capacity, and they naturally do all they can to equalise its pressure as much as is possible, and to alleviate the weight of the tax by purchases. At the same time, even an invader, when his stay is prolonged in his enemy's country, is not usually so barbarous and reckless as to lay upon that country the entire burden of his support. Thus the system of contributions of itself gradually approaches to that of magazines, at the same time without ever ceasing altogether, or sensibly losing any of that influence which it exercises on the operations of the war. For there is a wide difference between a case in which some of the resources which have been drawn from a country are replaced by supplies brought from more distant parts, the country, however, still remaining substantially the source on which the army depends for its supplies, and the case of an army which, as in the 18th century, provides for all its wants from its own resources, the country in which it is operating contributing, as a rule, nothing towards its support. The great difference consists in two things, namely the employment of the transport of the country and its ovens. In this way, that enormous burden of any army, that incubus which is always destroying its own work, a military transport train, is almost got rid of. It is true that even now no army can do entirely without some subsistence wagons, but this number is immensely diminished, and little more is required than sufficient to carry the surplus of one day on till the next. Peculiar circumstances, such in Russia in 1812, may even again compel an army to carry an enormous train, and also field ovens, but in the first place these are exceptional cases, for how seldom will it happen that 300,000 men make a hostile advance of 180 miles upon almost a single road, and that through countries such as Poland and Russia, and shortly before the season of harvest. And in the next place, any means of supply attached to an army in such case may be looked upon as only an assistance in case of need, the contributions of the country being always regarded as the groundwork of the whole system of supply. Since the first campaigns of the French Revolutionary War, the requisition system has formed constantly the mainstay of their armies. The armies opposed to them were also obliged to adopt the same system, and it is not at all likely that it will ever be abandoned. There is no other which can be substituted for it with the same results, both as regards its simplicity and freedom from restraint, and also as respects energy in the prosecution of the war. As an army is seldom distressed for provisions during the first 3 or 4 weeks of a campaign, whatever direction it takes, and afterwards can be assisted by magazines, we may very well say that by this method war had acquired the most perfect freedom of action. Certainly difficulties may be greater in one direction than in another, and that may carry weight in preliminary deliberation, but we can never encounter an absolute impossibility, and the attention which is due to the subject of subsistence can never decide a question imperatively. To this there is only one exception, which is a retreat through an enemy's country. In such case, many of the inconveniences connected with subsistence meet together. The operation is one of a continuous nature, generally carried on without a halt worth speaking of. There is, therefore, no time to procure provisions. The circumstances under which the operation commences are generally unfavourable, and it is therefore necessary to keep the troops in masses, and a dispersion of cantonments, or even any considerable extension in the width of the column cannot be allowed. The hostile feeling of the country precludes the chance of collection of contributions by mere orders issued without the support of a force capable of executing the order, and lastly, the moment is most auspicious for the inhabitants to give vent to their feelings by acts of hostility. On account of all this, an army so situated is generally obliged to confine itself strictly to its previously prepared lines of communication and retreat. When Bonaparte had to retreat in 1812, it was impossible for him to do so by any other line but the one upon which he had advanced, on account of the subsistence of his army. If he had attempted any other, he would have only been plunged into more speedy and certain destruction. All the censure, therefore, passed on him by even French writers, as well as by others with regard to this point, is sheer nonsense. 4. Subsistence from magazines. If we are to make a generic distinction between this method of subsisting troops and the preceding, it must be by an organisation such as existed for about 30 years at the close of the 17th and during the 18th century. Can this organisation ever reappear? Certainly we cannot conceive how it can be dispensed with if great armies are to be bound down for 7, 10 or 12 years long to one spot, as they have been formerly in the Netherlands, on the Rhine, in Upper Italy, Silesia and Saxony. For what country can continue for such a length of time to endure the burdens of two great armies, making it the entire source of their supplies, without being utterly ruined in the end, and therefore gradually becoming unable to meet the demands? But here naturally arises the question, shall the war prescribe the system of subsistence, or shall the latter dictate the nature of the war? To this we answer, the system of subsistence will control the war in the first place, as far as the other conditions on which it depends permit, but when the latter are encroached upon, the war will react on the subsistence system, and in such case determine the same. A war carried on by means of the system of requisitions and local supplies furnished on the spot has such an advantage over one carried on in dependence on issues from magazines, that the latter does not look at all like the same instrument. No state will therefore venture to encounter the former with the latter, and if any war minister should be so narrow-minded and blind to circumstances as to ignore the real relation which the two systems bear to each other, by sending an army into the field to live upon the old system, the force of circumstances will carry the commander of that army along with it in its course, and the requisition system would burst forth of itself. If we consider besides that the great expense attending such an organisation must necessarily reduce the extent of the armament in other respects, including of course the actual number of combatant soldiers, as no state has a superabundance of wealth, then there seems no probability of any such organisation being again resorted to, unless it should be adopted by the belligerents by mutual agreement, an idea which is a mere play of the imagination. Wars, therefore, may be expected henceforward always to commence with the requisition system. How much one or other government will do to supplement the same by an artificial organisation to spare their own country, etc., etc., remains to be seen. That it will not be overmuch we may be certain, for at such moments the tendency is to look upon the most urgent wants, and an artificial system of subsisting troops does not come under that category. But now, if a war is not so decisive in its results, if its operations are not so comprehensive as is consistent with its real nature, then the requisition system will begin to exhaust the country in which it is carried on, to that degree that either peace must be made, or means must be found to lighten the burden on the country, and to become independent of it for the supplies of the army. The latter was the case of the French army under Bonaparte in Spain, but the first happens much more frequently. In most wars the exhaustion of the state increases to that degree that, instead of thinking of prosecuting the war at a still greater expense, the necessity for peace becomes so urgent as to be imperative. Thus, from this point of view, the modern method of carrying on war has a tendency to shorten the duration of wars. At the same time, we shall not positively deny the possibility of the old system of subsistence reappearing in future wars. It will perhaps be resorted to by belligerents hereafter, where the nature of their mutual relations urge them to it, and circumstances are favourable to its adoption. But we can never perceive in that system a natural organisation. It is much rather an abnormal growth permitted by circumstances, but which can never spring from war in its true sense. Still less can we consider that form or system as any improvement in war, on the ground of it being more humane, for war itself is not a humane proceeding. Whatever method of providing subsistence may be chosen, it is but natural that it should be more easily carried out in rich and well-peopled countries than in the midst of a poor and scanty population. That the population should be taken into consideration lies in the double relation which that element bears to the quantity of provisions to be found in a country. First, because where consumption is large, the provision to meet that consumption is also large, and in the next place, because as a rule a large population produces also largely. From this we must certainly accept districts peopled chiefly by manufacturers, particularly when, as often the case, such districts lie in mountain valleys surrounded by unproductive land. But in the generality of cases it is always very much easier to feed troops in a well populated than in a thinly inhabited country. An army of 100,000 men cannot be supported on 400 square miles inhabited by 400,000 people, as well as it would be on 400 square miles with a population of 2,000,000 inhabitants, even supposing the soil equally good in the two cases. Besides, the roads and means of water carriage are much better in rich countries, and afford a greater choice, being more numerous, the means of transport are more abundant, the commercial relations easier and more certain. In a word, there is infinitely less difficulty in supporting an army in Flanders than in Poland. The consequence is that war with its manifold succours fixes itself by preference along high roads, near populous towns, in the fertile valleys of large rivers, or along such sea coasts as are well frequented. This shows clearly how the subsistence of troops may have a general influence upon the direction and form of military undertakings, and upon the choice of a theatre of war and lines of communication. The extent of this influence, what weight shall attach to the facility or difficulty of provisioning the troops, all that in the calculation depends very much on the way in which the war is to be conducted. If it is to be carried on in its real spirit, that is, with the unbridled force which belongs to its element, with a constant pressing forward to, or seeking for, the combat and decisive solution, then the sustenance of the troops, although an important, is but a subordinate affair. But if there is to be a state of equilibrium during which the armies move about here and there in the same province for several years, then the subsistence must often become the principal thing, the intendant of the commander-in-chief, and the conduct of the war an administration of wagons. There are numberless campaigns of this kind in which nothing took place. The plans miscarried, the forces were used to no purpose, the only excuse being the plea of a want of subsistence. On the other hand, Bonaparte used to say, "Qu'on n'aime pas pas de vivre." Certainly that general in the Russian campaign proved that such recklessness may be carried too far, for not to say that perhaps his whole campaign was ruined through that cause alone, which at best would be only a supposition, still it is beyond doubt that to his want of regard to the subsistence of his troops he was indebted for the extraordinary melting away of his army on his advance, and for its utter ruin on the retreat. But while fully recognising in Bonaparte the eager gambler who ventures on many a mad extreme, we may justly say that he and the revolutionary generals who preceded him dispelled a powerful prejudice in respect to the subsistence of troops, and showed that it should never be looked upon in any other light than as a condition of war, never as an object. Besides, it is with privation in war just as with physical exertion and danger. The demands which the general can make on his army are without any defined bounds. An iron character demands more than a feeble, sensitive man. Also, the endurance of an army differs in degree according as habit, military spirit, confidence in and affection towards the commander, or enthusiasm for the cause of fatherland, sustains the will and energy of the soldier. But this we may look upon as an established principle, that privation and want, however far they may be carried, should never be otherwise regarded than as transition states, which should be succeeded by a state of abundance, indeed even by superfluity. Can there be anything more touching than the thought of so many thousand soldiers, badly clothed, with packs on their backs weighing 30 or 40 pounds, toiling over every kind of road, in every description of weather, for days and days, continually on the march, health and life ever in peril, and for all that, unable to get a sufficiency of dry bread? Anyone who knows how often this happens in war is at a loss to know how it does not oftener lead to a refusal of the will and powers to submit any longer to such exactions, and how the mere bent constantly given to the imagination of human beings in one direction is capable of first calling forth and then supporting such incredible efforts. Let any one, then, who imposes great privations on his men, because great objects demand such a trial of endurance, always bear in mind, as a matter of prudence, if not prompted to it by his own feelings, that there is a recompense for such sacrifices which he is bound to pay at some other time. We have now to consider the difference which takes place in respect to the question of subsistence in war, according as the action is offensive or defensive. The defensive is in a position to make uninterrupted use of the subsistence which he has been able to lay in beforehand, as long as his defensive act continues. The defensive side, therefore, can hardly be in want of the necessaries of life, particularly if he is in his own country, but even in the enemy's this holds good. The offensive, on the other hand, is moving away from his resources, and as long as he is advancing, and even during the first weeks after he stops, must procure from day to day what he requires, and this can very rarely be done without want and inconvenience being felt. This difficulty is felt in its fullest force at two particular periods: first in the advance, before the decision takes place, then the supplies of the defensive side are all at hand, whilst the assailant has been obliged to leave his behind. He is obliged to keep his masses concentrated, and therefore cannot spread his army over any considerable space. Even his transport cannot keep close to him when he commences his movements preliminary to a battle. If his preparations have not been very well made, it may easily happen at this moment that his army may be in want of supplies for several days before the decisive battle, which certainly is not a means of bringing them into a fight in the highest state of efficiency. The second time a state of want arises is at the end of a victorious career, if the lines of communication begin to be too long, especially if the war is carried on in a poor, sparsely populated country, and perhaps also in the midst of a people whose feelings are hostile. What an enormous difference between a line of communication from Wilna to Moscow, on which every carriage must be forcibly seized, and a line from Cologne by Liège, Louvain, Brussels, Mons, and Valenciennes to Paris, where a mercantile contract or a bill of exchange would suffice to procure millions of rations. Frequently has the difficulty we are now speaking of resulted in obscuring the splendour of the most brilliant victories, reduced the powers of the victorious army, rendered retreat necessary, and then, by degrees, ended in producing all the symptoms of a real defeat. Forage, of which, as we have before said, there is usually at first the least deficiency, will run short soonest if a country begins to become exhausted, for it is the most difficult supply to procure from a distance on account of its bulk, and the horse feels the effect of low feeding much sooner than the man. For this reason an over numerous cavalry and artillery may become a real burden and an element of weakness to an army. End of chapter 14. Recording by Timothy Ferguson, Gold Coast, Australia.